and damn near went flying over top of it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the white van coming in hot, its tires screaming out in alarm as the nose of it dipped and the back end rose, and Patrick was pretty damn sure it was going to rear-end them. He didn't care. His eyes were already back on the woods, spotting the movement of a bit of brush, swaying like something had just thrashed through it. The white van rocked to a stop, inches from the lead pickup's bumper. Patrick's lever action was already shouldered, his eye already in the scope. He saw a flash of deep brown skin, almost black, wheeling away from the road. He'd wished for 2 seconds. What he got was about half of one. But sometimes you gotta take what you're given, and Patrick estimated where that sprinting body might have got to when it disappeared in the brush and broke the trigger, sending a big .45-70 projectile careening through the brush. He cycled that lever action with no regard for his splitting, cracking knuckles and managed to spit out 2 more rounds in as many seconds. Patrick paused only for the briefest of moments, his focus widening to take in the whole section of forest where he'd seen the figure, expecting a rush of movement as a pack of infected burst out of the woods. It didn't happen, and by the time the driver of the pickup leaned her head out the window and yelled a slew of curses and questions, Patrick was already vaulting over the side of the truck. "Stand by!" he shouted over his shoulder. Everything had happened so fast, he was 2 strides into the woods before the adrenaline hit him. Heart thrashing, lungs heaving, mouth dry. Some people said that adrenaline dumps gave them strength, but Patrick had never experienced that. When they struck him, he always hit his lactic acid threshold so much faster, gassing out within mere seconds. As a lifelong hunter, Patrick knew to note the location where he'd aimed his shots, and he had it in his head as he careened through the brush. A tall, forked tree leaning heavily towards the roadway. He could see it just ahead of him. He also had it in his head that Big Black was not to be underestimated. Patrick couldn't assume the creature had continued running. He had to assume it had stopped and doubled back and was now waiting to pounce on him. Unless Patrick had managed to score the hit of a lifetime and killed the beast with one of his 3 shots, it was still a threat. So Patrick moved quick, but he moved with both eyes open, gaze ripping back and forth for anything that looked out of place, his rifle up and ready. 3 shots down. The lever action's tube held 6, plus 1 in the chamber. That worried him. As he approached the forked tree, slowing his pace to a more cautious quick step, he dropped his support hand down and shucked 3 cartridges from the loops on his belt. Slowing even more now, expert eyes catching little bits of sign. A broken branch, some trampled brush, leaves upturned so their pale undersides were visible. He didn't over-focus on that, not yet, but kept his eyes moving, keenly aware that there was no predator or prey in this situation, just 2 entities that wanted to kill each other, each with a pretty good chance of success. Patrick hated the infected, but he respected them. He respected what they were capable of and how dangerous they were. Any tracker that didn't was soon to be a dead tracker. Calm, Patrick told himself. 360 security. Make sure you're safe before you go snooping. He stopped about 5 yards from the forked tree and pivoted, checking everywhere a body could hide, until he'd returned to facing the tree again. He peered further into the woods, where the brush was thinner and he could see a bit further. The track was subtle, but he'd been doing this for a long time, and his eyes picked it up almost immediately. A series of disturbances through the pine needle and leaf-strewn forest floor that created a sort of dot-to-dot trail leading away from Patrick, away from the road, further into the forest. Forcing some control over his breathing, Patrick tilted the rifle so the feed port on the right side was facing down, then began shoving the replacement cartridges in. Only when he was fully loaded and reasonably sure that the scene was secure did he lower his rifle out of his view. Still held it at the ready, though. He paced forward, his feet moving confidently and quietly across the forest floor. He stopped before he got to the tree, replaying the memory of those slim seconds in his mind. The face he'd seen had been close to this tree, he was almost certain, and it had already been running when he'd taken his first shot. Patrick moved around the tree and lined himself up with a series of scuffs that led off into the woods. They were pretty far apart, he thought, but that was good. That meant whatever it was had a long stride, which meant it was big, which meant Patrick had a really good chance that it actually was Big Black. A little further away, he noted that the scuffs were farther apart. The fleeing infected had sprinted bipedally for a dozen yards, then dropped to all fours, which seemed to be their preferred method of covering distance fast. He didn't track the trail. That would have been idiotic. But he wanted to know if he'd hit the thing. Patrick squatted, porting the rifle across his chest and peering across the ground before him, panning his gaze in slow, wide arcs. There! He rose and skittered forward a handful of yards. On the ground, a patch of blood. Not a lot, and not bright. This was dark, which meant it was venous, not arterial. He'd hit the fucker, but not good enough to bring it down. Still, his heart soared. He stood and backed away from the blood spore, his support hand grabbing up the handheld radio on his belt and keying it. Pat to base. How copy? He was roughly right in the middle of the two compounds, and the transmission came through nice and clear. Jimmy here, came a bored voice, probably expecting Patrick to report that he'd arrived in Winchuck without incident. Solid copy, boss. Go ahead. Get everyone loaded up and get your asses out to Ambush Alley. I think I just got a shot on Big Black. And I got blood spore. Chapter 8. Bran was sweating buckets. A sunburn across his neck and shoulders, but he was too hot to put his shirt back on. His arms were covered in little tiny cuts from the leaves of the corn plants he was harvesting. His hands were sticky with resin, gathering every bit of dirt and turning his palms almost black. His back ached from hauling baskets of dried field corn into the monastery's larder. He fucking loved it. It wasn't that he was a masochist, but a little discomfort, that was no big deal. And the best thing that he discovered about the pace of life here at the monastery, he barely had time to think. It was up before dawn and then chores, with a few breaks throughout the day wherein you were so damn tired you wouldn't bother your brain with thinking anyways. It was beautiful. It was all he'd ever wanted. For the last few days, Shay hadn't mentioned them leaving. She seemed to have settled into the idea of them sticking around. Maybe it was because of what Kat had said, or maybe it was the fact that her boys loved her. And of course, there was little Jacob, with his toothy, chimp-like grin, following Bran around and helping him harvest the corn. It'd break Jacob's heart if Bran left. Whatever Shay's reasons were, Bran was happy to work his ass off every day. Because not once had anyone come to him and told him that he had to go out and hurt some people. All that was required of him here was to sweat and strain in the sun, to harvest, to thresh, to pack away stores in the root cellar for winter, to hoe, to till, and to plant, to make things grow, to be a part of a cycle of life instead of a cycle of death. He didn't know what he'd done that had convinced the universe or God or Jesus or Buddha to have mercy on him, but he knew better than to second-guess it. He had a good thing, for once. "Hoo boy," Bran grunted, stretching his back and squinting out at the block of field corn still needing to be harvested. Beside him, Jacob held the big harvesting basket, piled so high with corn cobs that only Jacob's eyes peered over the top. But the kid was a beast, in a nice way. So damn strong. The basket was probably half his own weight, and he just carried it along, never tiring, just happy to be of use, and particularly happy to be useful to Bran. "Jacob, I think it's time for a break," Bran announced. "I'm damn parched. You?" Jacob's eyes narrowed, a bit confused. "You thirsty?" Bran clarified. Jacob nodded eagerly. "All right then," he said. "Let's take this to the larder. You want me to carry it?" Jacob simply turned away and began tottering along with the giant basket hugged to his chest. He didn't seem inclined to give it up. Bran smiled as he followed the kid back towards the monastery. "Man, look at you. So strong." Jacob didn't talk much, but Bran could see his body language. He was preening a little bit, lugging the basket with sturdy arms and a straight back, all the muscles writhing under his dark skin. He really liked it when Bran was impressed by him. The larder was blessedly cool. A pretty roomy space, but that was good, considering the amount of stuff they harvested. Shay had really outdone herself, especially given the fact that she'd had only 4 years and for a good chunk of that time no real help. But she'd grown the gardens and plots into a sustainable source of food for their isolated little community. Jacob put the basket down just inside the door. next to the giant pile of corn cobs that took up that entire corner of the larder. Everywhere else, there were bins of grain from last season, piles of sweet potatoes, baskets full of almonds and walnuts. Seeing all the bounty, it was easy to believe you could just eat like a king every day, but Bran knew that it still had to be rationed. They were just now entering the harvest for some of the warm season crops, like corn, and because of that, it made the larder look stuffed. But it'd dwindle fast over the winter. Bran stepped outside, still in the shade of the monastery, and drew a pitcher of water from the rain barrel attached to the downspout just outside the larder door. He drank straight from the pitcher, then handed it to Jacob, who did the same. "You sure are a big help," Bran said, accepting the pitcher back and taking another long drink. Jacob nodded and flexed his arm, which, if Bran were being honest, he didn't need to pretend to be impressed by. Kid looked like a fucking linebacker if you shrunk one down to 4 feet tall. When he was full grown in the next couple years, Bran thought he'd give Elijah a run for his money. Bran drank a bit more and eyed the sky outside. "You know what, Jacob? It's fucking hot. Don't tell your mom I said that word. I say we shuck some corn in the shade for a bit. We can harvest the rest when it gets cooler. What do you say?" Jacob raised 2 thumbs and offered one of his rare words, awkwardly formed. "Okay. All right, then." Bran set the pitcher back beside the rain barrel. "Let's grab some chairs." "Bran!" Kat's voice, unmistakable to him, the tone urgent. Still, Bran was so tired from the day's labors and so lulled by the slow crawl of everyday life here that it didn't even stir him up much. He'd pushed violence so far out of his mind at that point, he figured it had to be something kinda urgent, but not really all that bad. Like maybe Mish had taken a tumble from a tree again. "Ah, hell," he murmured, stepping out of the shade and peering around the corner of the adobe wall where he'd heard Kat's shout coming from. Then the thought of violence did finally strike him, and he felt his guts clench up a bit, wondering if a couple of the boys had gone at it again. He was pretty sure Kat hadn't done any of her defensive training since they'd talked a few days prior. Then again, he suspected that the boys only needed to be instructed on violent things once. They did, after all, have a natural inclination towards it. One might even call it a talent. He hustled towards the front corner of the monastery. It was laid out like a big square, and the larder was on the north-facing side, which was generally thought of as the back of the monastery. Bran had almost reached the front when Kat came tearing around and almost plowed into him. She'd been running on all 4s. And that made him worry a bit more. She didn't typically do that unless shit was going down. "What happened?" he demanded as Kat stood up, nostrils flared but otherwise not even breathing hard from her sprint. "Elijah!" she snapped out, pointing to the inside of the complex. "Shot!" For all the shitty situations Bran had been in throughout his life, he didn't think he'd ever actually felt the sensation of his blood draining out of his head. He felt it then, undeniably. Damn near fainted like an old woman. But then he was running, with Kat right at his side, staying upright now. Jacob caught up to them, but Bran was barely paying attention at that point. "Who the fuck shot him?" Bran gnashed out as he tore through the main entrance of the monastery, cutting straight through the center of the courtyard garden towards the dormitories. "I didn't hear any gunshots." "Out," Kat growled back. "In the woods." Shit. What did that mean? Were there people out there? Had Elijah attacked them? It became obvious where the drama was unfolding by the cluster of bodies outside of Elijah's door, his brothers milling about the entrance, peering in at whatever was happening inside. Bran saw the looks on their faces as he burst into the shaded corridor. They were worried. Some of them displayed this by baring their teeth, their mouths stretched wide. Almost looked like they were laughing, but they didn't make a sound, and their eyes were all wrong and joyless. Bran and Kat tumbled into the room to find Elijah on his bed, Shay hunched over him. Blood stained the tousled sheets. Elijah was growling and mewling, rolling away from Shay's touch as she repeatedly snapped at him to hold still and stay on his side. "Elijah!" Her voice keened, cracking with emotion-curdled demand. "I can't help you if you don't hold still!" Elijah saw them come into the room and his eyes fixed on Kat, the expression of anger and pain on his face slackening as the two made eye contact. He seemed to draw some strength from her, or maybe he just didn't want to look weak in front of her. Either way, he stilled. When he did, Shay seized his left arm and lifted it. Elijah was laying on his right side, and Bran could see the wound leaking dark blood. It had gone in through the meat of his left lat and looked like it had exited the left side of his chest. His lung, Bran thought. There's no way it didn't hit his lung. He searched for another wound but couldn't see anything else. Elijah's tan pants, which was all he was wearing, were bloody from the waist down to mid-thigh, but only on the left side. "What do you need?" Bran demanded as he came to the bedside opposite Shay. "Tell me how to help." "Put pressure on that chest wound," Shay snapped, then turned her head to her boys. "Shad, get me a pitcher of water. Mish, I need my medical kit. Do you know where it is?" Shad had already taken off running. Mish backpedaled from the door with a barked, "Yes," then disappeared. Bran put his knee on the side of the bed beside Elijah, locking eyes with the big hybrid as he brought his hand up to his chest wound. Elijah's nose wrinkled at the corners, a snarl working across his lips. "Don't fucking bite me," Bran ground out, then pressed his palm to the wound. Elijah jerked, eyes widening for a flash. Then his mouth gaped, teeth flashing, head snapping towards Bran's arm. Bran kept his hand on the wound, but yanked his forearm away. "I said don't fucking bite me!" Shay, now putting pressure on the back wound, gave Elijah a nudge to his backside with her knee. "Hey, knock it off! He's trying to help! He's doing what I told him to do! We have to keep the blood inside of you!" Then Shay and Bran met each other's eyes over Elijah's form. "Who did this?" Bran demanded. She shook her head. "I don't know. There shouldn't be anyone around." She looked at Elijah. "Where'd this happen, Elijah?" Elijah groaned and growled, then panted for a few seconds before seeming to get enough breath to speak. "The road." "The road?" she demanded, as though she'd never heard of the concept. "We passed a road on the way here," Bran said, a little confused by Shay not connecting the dots. "It looked pretty well-traveled. Did you not know you had a road in use nearby you?" "I told you," she said, straining as she pressed on the wound. "I never leave the compound." Bran goggled at her. "You said you didn't get out much. I didn't know that meant you didn't get out ever." "I was being euphemistic." "Well, pardon me for misunderstanding." They glared at each other for a beat. "Are there any other settlements around here?" Bran rejoined. "If there's a road in use, it's usually because there's at least two groups keeping in touch." "I told you," Shay snarled. "So you literally have no idea of who's around you?" "It doesn't affect me." "Well, it does now." All the ire went out of her face. "Oh God, Bran," she breathed. "Are they gonna come looking?" Bran blinked a few times, not knowing how to answer that, then looked to Elijah. "What happened out by the road? Can you tell me?" "Just watching," Elijah struggled out. "Curious." "What were you watching?" "Cars." "Like multiple cars?" "3. To Shay, Bran said, "Sounds like a convoy." Back to Elijah. "Do you see this often? These cars on the road?" "Sometimes," he grunted. "Have they ever shot at you before?" "Never seen me watching." "Shit." Bran locked onto Shay again. "I don't need to tell you that other folks aren't near as comfortable with hybrids as we are. They probably thought he was another primal." "Are they gonna come for us?" she hissed. Bran didn't know. If they did, it'd be a ballsy move. Most folks fought to keep the primals at bay, but didn't actively go out hunting them. Then again, it appeared no one here knew shit about these people or how they operated. He turned, finding Cat hovering right over his shoulder. "Cat, I want you to go keep an eye on those woods to the south." He hesitated, glancing back at Elijah. "It was the road to the south, right?" Elijah nodded, his big teeth clenched together, and issued what sounded like an affirmative grunt. Cat was already backpedaling towards the door. "The second you see anyone, you slip back here and let me know." "Got it." Cat seethed, then spun and shot out the door. Shad appeared right as she left, carrying the clay pitcher, dark and dripping water, filled to the brim. Mish wasn't far behind, lugging a battered plastic tote bin. "Shad, put your hand where my hand is and press hard," Shay instructed, then slipped her bloody hands out of the way as Shad put his in. She snatched the lid off the tote and came out with a handful of bandages. Not neat, individually wrapped, sterile bandages. These looked like she'd made them herself from whatever cotton rag she could find. "You know how to handle a popped lung?" Bran asked. She glanced at him, her lack of confidence obvious. "Theoretically. I've just never done it." Well, theoretical knowledge was better than complete ignorance, Bran supposed. It wasn't like he was any medical marvel himself. His job had been to create life-threatening wounds, not heal them. Shay wet a wad of bandages, wrung the excess water out, set it off to the side, dove back into the tote, and came out with what looked a hell of a lot like a sandwich baggie and a roll of medical tape. Bran frowned. "What are we doing here, Shay?" "Occlusive dressing," she said distractedly as she used a pair of shears to cut the sandwich baggie in half along its seam. Bran had no idea what an occlusive dressing was, but said, "Oh, okay," as though it all made sense to him. Once she had the baggie cut into a large square, she snatched up a dry bandage and tossed it onto Elijah's side near Bran's hands. She spoke hurriedly as she began applying medical tape to 3 sides of the plastic square. "When I tell you to, I need you to take that bandage, create a little wad on one end, stuff it into the hole." "Stuff it into the hole? He's gonna—" "Don't fucking interrupt me! Just do what I tell you to do." "Right." "Stuff it into the hole until it's nice and compact, then ball the rest of it up on top of the wound and hold it there. You got that?" Sure. Yeah, I got it."
"Do it now."
Bran kept one hand on the wound and gathered up a wad of bandage with his other. Shay leaned over Elijah and spoke softly but firmly.
"Elijah, he's going to press that bandage into the wound. It's going to hurt you, but you are not to bite him. Do you understand me?"
Elijah only growled menacingly, glaring at Bran, which did not make him feel confident that a chunk wouldn't be taken out of his arm in the very near future.
"What do we do when we see red?"
Shay urged.
"Count." "Good. Show me how well you can count."
Elijah began counting, his respirations rising as he saw Bran prepping to do the deed. Bran steeled himself as though the pain would be inflicted on him, pulled his hand away, and pressed the wad of bandage into the wound channel. The effect was immediate. Elijah lunged, and it was only by some rare happenstance of quick cognition that Bran saw his teeth never parted but remained clenched. So he didn't even recoil as Elijah's face jutted up at his, spittle bubbling between his elongated canines as the hybrid seethed out a breath through his teeth. Bran felt momentarily proud of himself for his coolness, gave Elijah a sympathetic look. "It's all right, buddy. I know this sucks." He packed the wound, then wadded what was left and pressed it over the rest. "Okay, what now?"
"Hold it there for a sec,"
Shay said, finishing up her homemade occlusive dressing, whatever the hell that was. Once she had it ready, she took the bandage she'd wet and cleaned the area around the wound, then used another bandage to dry it off. The occlusive dressing went over the packed wound, sealing it with a bandage inside. She tamped the tape down to Elijah's skin, leaving just the corner closest to his ribs unsecured. Bran started to think about people coming through the woods again, people that had taken a shot at Elijah, likely because they mistook him for a full primal. But would it make a difference if they knew he was a hybrid? Bran had a hard time believing that, especially if they were already keyed up. "Shay, do you have any weapons at all in this place?" She gave him a look that was somehow both amazed and disappointed.
"I have a rule about violence, and this is a monastery. No, we don't have any weapons, Bran."
She shook her head.
"Why would you want weapons anyways?"
Now it was Bran's turn to look amazed and disappointed. Because someone tried to fucking kill Elijah? And they might show up here? And if they do, what do you think they'll want to do?" She stared blankly at him as she created a second occlusive dressing, which Bran assumed was going to go on the back wound which Shad was still holding. "Are you serious?" Bran hissed, not sure why he had lowered his voice. "Do you really not know? Or do you just not know what to say?" Her eyes flashed. She knew.
"Well, what the hell do you want me to do about it, Bran?"
"Look, I know you have a thing against violence, but this is—"
"No,"
she snapped.
"I am not going to let this turn into a bloodbath."
"You might not have a fucking option."
"If they show up, we can talk to them."
"Really?" Bran's voice went almost squeaky in disbelief. "Do you really think you're going to be able to convince some people to be okay with a compound full of hybrids right next to their favorite road?"
"They're not full mutants."
"I know that. You know that." Bran shook his head vigorously. They don't fucking know that. And if you think you're going to be able to explain it to them, you're dreaming a dream.
We don't even know if they're gonna show up.
Kat burst through the door. All eyes turned to her. She panted, jacking a thumb over her shoulder.
Someone's coming.
Chapter 9. Patrick took point in a wedge-shaped formation. Warren and Hugo flanked him to either side, armed with AR platform carbines, ready to lay hate if shit got spicy. The blood trail had gotten light, which wasn't a good sign. Patrick already knew the shot he'd gotten on the creature hadn't been a good one, but he'd still hoped to see more blood as he went, not less. The fact that it had dwindled to just a few drops every dozen strides meant that Big Black, if it actually was him, was definitely not on death's door, which meant that Patrick and his team were in for a fight. Luckily, the trail hadn't gone cold. The wounded infected had continued to gallop quadrupedally, leaving plenty of sign to track it by. The trail had led them to what looked like an old road. Patrick had almost missed it, it was so overgrown, but then noticed how everything in a wide, straight path was all new growth, saplings and brush. A few scuffs of Patrick's toe through the loamy earth revealed the remnants of a gravel road, which was a mighty curious thing, because if there'd been a road here once, then that meant people used to come this way for something. But the wilderness between O'Brien and Winchuck was supposed to be, well, wilderness. After 2 miles of careful tracking along that buried road, Patrick found what it led to, and couldn't believe his eyes. Squatting in the brush, maybe 10 yards from the edge of the woods, Patrick leaned to his right and whispered, "Hugo, the fuck am I looking at?" Hugo peered through the undergrowth, his lips pursed beneath his mustache. He was kneeling, sitting back on his heels, with his keg belly protruding. It wasn't that he was fat, he just had a big torso, but it was hard as rock. Patrick knew. He made a habit of patting it for good luck. "Old church, maybe?" Hugo offered. "A lot of crucifixes, like an old mission or something." To Patrick's left, Warren made an uncertain noise. "Well, someone's living there." Someone indeed. From their vantage point, they could see straight into a large entrance, through which the gravel road must have led when it was visible. Beyond that entrance was what looked like a courtyard, and in that courtyard was a well-tended garden. How the hell did we not know about this place? Patrick wondered. Right across from Ambush Alley, Hugo observed. Not a place we cared to hang out. That was true enough, but hell, maybe they should have done a bit more exploring in this area. It alarmed the fuck out of Patrick that there might be a settlement of people right smack dab between O'Brien and Winchuck. People that they'd never met, and people that you've never met might be dangerous. "Trail definitely leads here," Warren said. "Maybe it skirted around the perimeter and continued on the other side." Hugo looked at Patrick. "What do you want to do?" Patrick considered his options. They could cut around the clearing where the compound stood and try to pick up sign on the other side. But if there was a settlement between O'Brien and Winchuck, shouldn't they at least try to make contact and figure out who these people were? And if it was Big Black that he'd seen, there was always the possibility that the people in this settlement had recently been slaughtered. The infected like to make their nests in man-made structures. This place seemed like it could be a cozy home for Big Black and his ilk. "We need to figure out what's going on here," Patrick said. "If Big Black wiped these people out, we need to know about it. And if he didn't, and they're still alive, we should probably know that, too. Maybe introduce ourselves. Get a feel for who they are." Warren was dubious. "And if Big Black did set up his den here, we're gonna get a welcoming party." Patrick made a face. "I don't know, man. If this place was crawling with infected, don't you think they'd have scented us and come out to meet us already? Unless they're waiting for us to walk out in the open," Hugo put in. Patrick sighed through his nose, then turned in place. Behind him, Ace, Wendell, and Jimmy were huddled, covering their backs and sides. Patrick gave them a psst, and when he had their attention, spoke in hushed tones. "Y'all make a line right here, overlapping fields of fire. I'm gonna walk out there solo and see if I can make contact with any humans. But if it's infected that come out to greet me, we'll beat a bounding retreat. Got it?" They all got it. Warren put a hand on his arm. "You sure you don't want company?" Patrick shook his head, rising slowly to his feet. If it's just people in there, I don't want to come off too aggressive, you know? So stay hidden. Let's not advertise that we got him under the gun." He hesitated. "But, you know, if shit goes bad, we got you," Hugo assured him. Nodding, Patrick stood to his full height, keeping his rifle in both hands but held low, non-threatening. Here goes nothing. Then he pushed through the last bit of woods and emerged out into the midday sun. He walked slowly towards the adobe-walled compound. Thought that maybe Hugo was right. Place sure seemed like an old Spanish mission. Not actually that old, but in the same style. Arched windows with metalwork crosses in them. He kept his strong hand on his rifle's grip, but raised his support hand, showing his palm in the universal human sign for "I mean you no harm." He hoped the lever action supported that impression. Granted, it could blow a 2-inch hole in someone, but when people saw old lever actions, they just thought of Granddad's musty old rifle. A carbine, though? Oh, that was a scary, black assault weapon, despite the fact that the projectiles it fired were a sixth the size of the ones that came out of his lever action. He stopped about 50 yards from the center entryway. "Hello?" he called out, his adrenaline surging at the sound of his voice cutting through the still, humid air. Insects chittered. Grasshoppers fluttered their papery wings. No response. He took another few cautious steps forward. "Anyone home? I don't mean any trouble. I'm from the nearby settlement of O'Brien." Eyes scanning as he talked, searching for any movement. "We encountered an infected and tracked it right to your complex. We're concerned it might still be in the area. You and your people could be in danger. We only want to help." He could have sworn he heard the sound of a wooden door closing. It was light, but Patrick had pretty good hearing, especially when he was all nervous like this. He went still and silent, his grip tightening on the rifle, but still keeping his support hand raised. Sweat trickled down into his eyebrows, down the ridge of his nose. And then a voice. "I'm coming out." It sounded like a woman. "I'm unarmed. Don't shoot." Patrick relaxed, but only a little bit. "It's okay, ma'am. I'm only armed for my own protection. I have no intention of harming anyone." A figure emerged from around the corner of the entryway, a tall black woman, and she did not look happy. She hesitated there for a moment, skewering Patrick with a baleful glare, then marched out to meet him. She had a rag and appeared to be cleaning her hands with it. The rag itself was once white, now smeared with red. She stopped about 10 yards from him. Didn't seem to want to come further, and honestly, Patrick couldn't blame her. But he was mighty confused as to why she seemed so pissed at him, and also why she was wiping blood off her hands. "You say you have no intention of harming anyone?" she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "Was it you that shot my husband?" Patrick's jaw fell open. "Oh, Jesus! Ma'am, no, I didn't shoot your husband." She balled the bloody rag into one fist, then planted her hands on her hips. "Oh, you didn't? Were you at the road a few miles south of here?" Patrick swallowed. Yeah, but it wasn't a person I shot. I shot an infected and tracked it here. It might still be in the area, ma'am. You might be in—" "Right, yeah, you said," she snapped. "I might be in danger. But the only danger I see is you, a guy that can't identify his fucking target before he fires on it." Patrick's mind was reeling. There was no fucking way. Unless— Oh, shit. Had he been so keyed up to find Big Black that he'd just seen a random black guy in the woods and shot him? His skin started to tingle, particularly his hands. Felt his knees get a little weak. Patrick didn't feel a damn molecule of regret for all the infected he'd hunted and killed over the years, but he counted himself lucky that he'd never had to kill another human being. The concept of making such a horrendous mistake made him feel sick. But there was no way. He'd seen that face. He'd seen the mutations in it. Hadn't he? Unless you saw what you wanted to see. "Ma'am, I shot an infected." Patrick tried again, not real comfortable with how uncertain his voice came out. "Yeah? Is your husband okay? Does he need help? I can— Bran!" the woman yelled over her shoulder. "Can you walk out here?" A strangled groan came from somewhere near the entryway the woman had come from. Then a man's voice, sounding like it was in a world of hurt. I think so." Patrick didn't know if he felt relieved or not that the woman's husband was at least still alive and able to walk. Then again, he'd clearly been able to walk if he'd been the one that made the trail through the woods. But what about all those signs he'd seen from an infected running on all fours? A man emerged from around the corner, moving at a slow hobble. His face was a haggard mask of pain. He was clutching his side. He wore no shirt, just a pair of khaki pants that were soaked with blood almost to the knee, right below where the man held his side. Beneath his clutching hands, Patrick could see a bloody bandage. Except, this guy was white. Now Patrick didn't know what the hell to believe. It was already hard enough to accept that the face he'd seen had been a normal human. It was damn near impossible to accept that it had been a white guy, and Patrick had just completely imagined up the dark-skinned part. Patrick could almost feel his team's eyes boring into the back of his head. He could almost hear their thoughts. Pat's really lost his touch. So obsessed with finding Big Black, he sees the beast in every moving bush. Man, this was bad. The woman hurried to her husband's side, letting him drape a sweaty arm over her shoulder and helping him along. Completely off his game, Patrick stuttered forward a few steps.
You don't have to make him walk out here. I can— No!
The woman snapped at him.
You don't come any closer. You stay right where you are.
It seemed to take an hour for the wounded man to cross the distance, and the whole time Patrick's brain lashed back and forth between shuddering regret, how could you be so fucking stupid, and resolute denial. There's no way this is the guy I shot. They stopped, still keeping that 10-yard distance between them. Closer now, Patrick realized the man's entire lower belly was wrapped. He seemed to be holding the front right above his hip, but Patrick figured there was another hole around the back.
Look familiar?
The woman demanded, thrusting a hand at her husband, who looked woozy, like he might keel over at any second.
Ma'am, sir, I'm sorry, but he's not what I shot.
Is he okay? Is there organ damage?
No,
the man husked through clenched teeth.
At least I don't think there is. But you fucking shot me, man.
If you're standing, then I only winged you, Patrick thought, but wisely chose to keep that to himself. He shook his head, becoming more resolute in his denial.
Guys, the infected that I shot was dark-skinned. Darker than her. It's a big, nasty one I've been hunting for years. He's the alpha of a pack that runs around these parts. That's who I shot.
Something passed over the woman's face. Something that scoured the anger right out of her and replaced it with fear. But then the man and the woman shared just a hint of a glimpse, and she went right back to being angry again. The man leaned heavily on her, breathing raggedly.
It was you. I saw you. I don't know who you think you saw. You were in a two-tone pickup truck, right?
The man wheezed. Then he must have seen the confirmation of that in the shock that came over Patrick's face, because he nodded like he'd won the argument.
It was you. I looked at you, you looked at me, and then you fucking shot me.
That was precisely what had happened. And yet, Patrick found himself shaking his head, still unwilling to accept the magnitude of this mistaken identity. Then Patrick said possibly the dumbest thing he could have said, but really, he was grasping at this point. So sure that this had to be some sort of mistake, and yet so very unsure.
Well, why'd you run from me?
He immediately regretted it. The woman looked like her eyes might pop out of her head. The man looked suddenly reinvigorated by anger.
Because you were pointing a fucking rifle at me!
The man bellowed, then winced, moaned, and wilted into his wife.
How many rounds did I fire at you?
Patrick suddenly demanded, getting the sense that there was just something not quite believable about this. Getting the sense that he was being hoodwinked, but for what purpose he couldn't even begin to fathom.
I don't fucking know,
the man groaned.
What does it matter? You shot me. I think you need to leave,
the woman seethed at him.
You and all your buddies hiding in the woods.
She waved a hand over Patrick's shoulder. Shit. Had she actually seen them, or was she just guessing?
There's a reason we keep to ourselves out here. To avoid wingnuts like you. Go back to your fucking settlement and leave us the fuck alone.
Can I offer you any sort of medical help? Patrick stammered.
We have a doctor back at— Leave!
She screamed, already backing away towards her compound.
And don't come back here. And if my husband dies of some fucking infection because of this, I swear to God, you better not show your fucking face around here.
Patrick stood there, stupidly still holding his support hand up, his heart thudding guiltily in his chest, but still with that nagging feeling like something wasn't right. Or was that just his pride? Was he that unwilling to accept that he'd made a mistake? Or was he just that confident in what he'd seen? Patrick had been hunting his entire life. He'd never once, not once, had a case of mistaken identification. He'd never shot someone's dog thinking it was a deer. Always took the time to make sure that what he was pointing his rifle at was the thing he actually wanted to kill. But you didn't take your time, did you? Well, no. He hadn't had the time. He'd only had a half second to get a shot off on the bane of his existence, a creature that he'd only had the opportunity to lay eyes on a handful of times in 6 years. As the couple turned and shambled back into their compound, Patrick dropped his hand to his side and called out a confused but nonetheless earnest, "I'm sorry!" None of Patrick's team spoke until they'd retraced their steps to where the trail diverged from the buried road. Once Patrick got to that spot, he figured he was far enough away not to get the isolated little settlement's panties in a twist, so he took a knee and hung his head. He didn't need to invite questions. He knew they were coming. Warren crouched by a thick pine, his eyebrows all furrowed tight. What the fuck was that? Patrick sucked on his teeth. Welp, did you overhear any of it? Just the parts where the lady was yelling at you? Patrick nodded, resting his rifle on one knee and picking at a bit of green leaf that had got stuck between the barrel and the stock. Well, I'm sure you got the gist of it. Hugo was standing, thumbs hooked into his belt beneath his belly, his carbine resting on top of it from a sling. Was that the guy you thought was Big Black? No, Patrick said confidently. Then less confidently, I don't know. So... Warren peered skyward as though trying to piece it together. What did you see that made you think it was Big Black? His fucking face. That guy's face? Because I hate to break it to you, but he's white. Like, real white. Hugo shrugged. He had a dark beard. No, it wasn't that guy's face, Patrick said irritably. The face I saw on the side of the road was black, and it wasn't human. Hey, Hugo offered in a conciliatory voice. Hard to get a perfect ID when you're driving by at 50 miles an hour, you know? We all make mistakes. Fuck, Patrick spat. Not that big of a mistake. So... Warren again, still trying desperately to wrap his head around this. You're saying that wasn't the guy you shot? Was that what he was saying? Patrick was so confused. I'm saying... That dude's face is not the face I saw on the side of the road right before I shot. Somewhat ashamedly, he recalled with perfect clarity that he hadn't really seen much at the moment he'd broken the shot. At that point, it had just been something moving through the brush, and no matter his desperation to get a bullet into Big Black, he knew that was a rookie move. You don't fire your weapon at shaking bushes. You fire your weapon at a target. He was bracing himself against having to admit that because... If his team kept pressing for details, he wasn't going to lie to them. Well, Hugo said. Do you believe them? Patrick frowned at him, but he was relieved they hadn't asked more about the actual shooting. What do you mean, do I believe them? Do I believe the dude got shot? Well, it sure seems like he did. Do I believe it was him I saw on the side of the road? Patrick considered it once again, trying to free his mind from confirmation bias and simply remember exactly what he'd seen. But he was pretty damn sure of his memory. No, I don't believe that. I know what I saw. Hugo squatted in front of him, his dark eyes earnest. That means one of two things, boss. Oh, enlighten me. Either that dude was on the side of the road with Big Black, and he was the one that you tagged, and Big Black got away, or they're lying to protect Big Black. Warren made a deeply pained face. Really, Hugo? Neither of those options are even in the same hemisphere as realistic. That dude was a normal human. If he'd been with Big Black on the side of the road, he'd still be there, but in pieces. And protecting Big Black? The fuck would they do that for? None of that makes any sense. Hugo shrugged. There is a third possibility, Warren.
Well, your other two didn't seem like very possible possibilities. Hugo nodded to Patrick. Boss here dreamed up Big Black's face on the side of the road and tagged an innocent. That's the other possibility. No one replied to that. Burning inside and out, Patrick stood up. I know what I fucking saw. Chapter 10. He's a tough kid, Bran said to Shay later that evening. He was trying to be comforting, but Shay didn't look very comforted. He'll make it through this. They sat on that same stone bench overlooking the courtyard gardens. Everything was in deep shade now, as the sun dipped below the monastery's roofline and the trees beyond. A line of clouds bisected the cobalt sky, blazing orange and pink in the setting sun. Shay stared hollowly out at her garden, or perhaps nothing at all. She was leaning forward, elbows on her knees. She clutched a wet rag, pink from scrubbing the blood from her hands. It was still there, though, clogging her cuticles and fingernails. Bran's hands were smeared with it too, making the webbing between his fingers sticky. He sat down with a tired grunt, then held a hand out for the rag. Shay stared at his hand like she didn't know what it was for a moment, then plopped the wet rag into his hands. He began scrubbing the blood. Pinkish water dribbled out of the rag when he pressed it hard. It had taken this long to perform surgery on Elijah. If you could call it surgery. That felt like a lofty name for what they'd done. What Shay had done mostly, with Bran just handing her what she asked for and putting his hands where she needed them. Elijah's left lung had collapsed, as Bran had figured it would. The occlusive dressings, which Bran learned were there to seal the wound from air getting into the chest cavity, had staved off the worst of it, but Shay still had to make an incision through his lower left ribs to drain the air and blood out of the space vacated by his partially shriveled lung. They had no anesthetic for Elijah, so Bran gave him his belt to gnaw on, which he'd nearly chewed in half. Into that incision, Shay had placed a plastic tube. Where she'd gotten it, he didn't know, but it looked a hell of a lot like the water hose for a refrigerator, possibly from one of the two defunct fridges in the monastery's kitchen. Regardless, Bran had been impressed with her forethought in gathering those supplies and many others into her medical bin. She'd really tried to plan for everything, and if she hadn't, Elijah might not be alive now. Alive, but weak and unconscious. He'd lost a lot of blood. More had continued to dribble out through the tube in his side, draining into a pan on the floor by his bed. They had no means of testing for blood types, and for all of Shay's homemade medical devices, she didn't have the capability for a blood transfusion, even if they could determine a donor. But like Bran had said, Elijah was tough. Primals, and by extension hybrids, were all tough. Their constitutions were more like animals than humans. High pain tolerance, fast healing, and resistant to infection. They'd given Elijah the best chance they could. The rest was up to him and his body. You did a good job with that guy that showed up, Bran noted, nodding out through the courtyard towards the front entrance. They hadn't talked about it at all. Been too busy trying to save Elijah's life for the last several hours. Bran was exhausted. Physically, sure, but that was just from the day's labors. This was emotional exhaustion, he thought. He felt wiped out. And Shay looked like she was 2 steps from comatose. She still didn't respond. Hey. Bran thought about laying a hand on her shoulder, but wasn't sure how she'd take it. You did everything you could do. But we gotta think about the bigger picture here. I am thinking about the bigger picture, she said tonelessly. I think the guy believed us, Bran offered. That was quick thinking, using the bloody pants and bandages on me. That, and a quick demand for details from Elijah, had given them enough ammunition to ward off the stranger. And his companions, which they hadn't seen, but Kat had told them there were at least 5 or 6 others. I'm not worried about the guy, Shay said. Bran sighed. Well, worrying about Elijah ain't gonna make him heal quicker, and it'll only run you ragged with anxiety in the meantime. You're a believer. Have faith. It's not that. She frowned. I mean, it is that. Of course I'm worried about Elijah. She finally turned to fix him with haunted eyes, and he could see that her fear went far deeper. Elijah's strong. I know he can pull through this. But how long will that take?
Bran shook his head. I don't know. However long he needs. We'll pick up his slack. Shay gave him a caustic look.
We can't pick up his slack on everything.
Bran could only stare, uncomprehending. She leaned towards him, lowering her voice like she didn't want others to hear.
Without Elijah out patrolling the woods, how long until his scent fades? How long until Khan isn't frightened off by another male's scent? How long until he starts coming around again?
Shit. He hadn't thought about that.
He'll come,
Shay said with tombstone certainty.
He'll finish the job he started. He doesn't want these boys, my boys, to be here.
Her face flashed bitter and severe.
He wants them all dead, Bran. All of them. And now the door's open.
Bran felt it was important not to skip over the fact that he and Shay would likely be dead too, but then figured Shay knew that, and saying so wouldn't really help. There's still that female hybrid, he offered. The matriarch. Queen Bee. Seems like she's still trying to protect you and the boys. Neither of them said it, but Bran could tell they were both thinking it. Kat's words rolling around in their heads. How long? How long until Queen Bee was too old to hold her position as matriarch? How long until she was replaced by another? Hopefully long enough for Elijah to get back on his feet. Shay looked back out over her garden again, fingers wrestling each other.
You think those people will come back?
I don't know, Bran admitted. But I think we need to discuss setting up a watch. Someone should be on lookout 24/7. Shad, Mish, and Abed are old enough to help. Me and Kat can take shifts too. Shane nodded slowly, apparently accepting the idea. But Bran was thinking, and then what? Without weapons, what would they be able to do? Only sound the alarm. Like an air raid siren that only had the ability to tell you death was coming, but could do nothing to stop it. 3 evenings later, they'd established their rhythm of watch duties, but Bran wasn't so sure he didn't want to make a swap. He'd been up at dawn that day, as per the usual, finished up with all the corn and then hoed the pumpkin patch. Physically exhausted, and yet, with each passing day since Elijah had been laid up, Bran had grown more and more tense. The question of how long burned in his mind over and over.
Dark,
Kat said quietly. They were completing a slow walk around the perimeter of the tree line, and the sky was dipping towards navy blue, the woods standing beneath it in black, featureless etchings.
I watch. You sleep.
Yes, that was the plan. Nah, you go ahead, Bran said. I'll take the first watch tonight. Kat paused on the buried gravel road to the monastery, giving Bran an evaluating look.
Tired. Old man. Needs sleep.
Oh, fuck you with that old man shit. She chuffed, a rare expression of humor. He'd never heard her outright laugh, but occasionally she'd chuckle or snort. I've gotten myself all worked up today, Bran admitted. Won't be able to sleep for another few hours anyways. He gave her a look. Besides, you've had 4 overnight shifts in the last 2 days. Aren't you tired? She looked surprised at the implication, seemed to consider herself for a moment, then shook her head.
Not tired.
She looked to the east, where a little less than a half moon was peeking over the treetops at them.
Moonlight. Energy.
Bran quirked an eyebrow. Well, aren't you a lunar princess? She frowned, not understanding. Never mind. How much do you sleep at night anyways? She shrugged.
4, 5 hours?
Christ, what do you do the rest of the time?
Listen. Watch.
Well, you go on drawing energy from the moonlight, but I'm still gonna take the first watch tonight. She shrugged again.
I'll take second.
Need me to wake you up when it's your turn?
No,
she said.
I'll come.
She didn't move back towards the monastery. Something else? Bran prompted. She turned to look at him, the moon only illuminating the side of her face so he couldn't see much of her expression.
Need violence.
Bran's shoulders slumped. Don't start with this again, Kat. Man, she could really be like a dog with a bone once she got an idea in her head. She growled irritably.
Khan, strangers, shot Elijah.
She spread her hands towards the monastery.
No weapons, no guns, only claws, teeth.
Yeah, we got plenty of claws and teeth, though.
Not enough. They need to learn.
And why do you have to teach them, Cat? Bran demanded. Isn't it pretty instinctive for y'all? I mean, no one taught you how to fight, did they? You picked it up pretty well. Maybe a little too well. Cat shook her head as though she were exasperated with Bran.
I was encouraged to be violent. I learned and practiced.
She gestured back at the monastery again.
Them, not allowed. All peace. All mushy-mushy. No violence. No practice. Bad idea. Instinct, not enough. Need practice. No practice. Khan comes. Kills everyone. Maybe strangers come. Kill everyone, too.
Or maybe, Bran said, resting his hands on Cat's shoulders and giving them a gentle squeeze, none of that will happen. Cat let out a sibilant noise of dissatisfaction.
Wishes and fishes.
Bran winced. He'd forgotten he'd told her about that, about what his mom used to say to him. If wishes were fishes, we'd all cast nets. Later that night, Bran was finishing up his rounds. Everyone else had gone to bed, even Shay, who usually stayed up reading by the light of a tallow candle. But the window to her room was dark now. Just the crickets and the frogs and the night birds to keep him company. He was getting tired, and that was a good thing. He'd sleep like a rock, and he had been since he got to the monastery, save for the last few days since Elijah had been shot and those people came sniffing around. The only thing that kept his heavy eyelids from drooping was the reality that he was walking outside in the middle of the night, surrounded by Oregon wilderness and all that it might contain. It had felt really good not to think about violence, to give up on toting a weapon all the time and always thinking about what threat was going to come at you next and who you were going to have to blow holes in. Yeah, that had been good for him, but right at that moment, he sure wished he had a firearm. Still, as he strode slowly along just outside the adobe walls, he found himself thinking about all that, the course of his life, all the things that had led him down all those roads he never wanted to walk. If you'd known him as a kid, you wouldn't believe what he'd eventually become. He'd been a crier, if you could believe that. Super sensitive. For instance, that time when he was around 6 years old, and he'd become fascinated with the little grass snake that he'd found beneath a landscaping timber along the front walk of his childhood home. Went out to visit it almost every day, which, in his young memories, seemed like it had been months, but realistically had probably been less than a week. Pretty much became best friends with the little beastie. Then there'd been a game of hide-and-go-seek with the neighborhood kids. He never did find out which one of those assholes had done it, or whether it was intentional or an accident, but when he went out to hang with his little serpent buddy the next day, he found it dead, crushed. Someone had stepped on the landscaping timber and flattened it. You'd have thought his dog had been run over by a car. He was inconsolable, sat outside on the sidewalk weeping, and melodramatically sang a refrain of Amazing Grace. His parents had different takes on it. His mother, "These things happen, Bran. Little snakes like that don't live forever." His father, "It was a fucking snake, Bran. You need to toughen the fuck up." There were lots of incidents like that. Yes, young Bran was a sensitive child,